Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is broadcast number 745. The program is titled World Watchers. The date is March the 17th, 1986. I suggest you tape this 1-hour broadcast. I always suggest that. And if you want printed sheets of the sources of information, you can write to me, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, Carmel, California. And please send a self-addressed stamped envelope. And I suggest if you want the bibliography sheets for the month of February or the month of March, 4 sheets go into an envelope for 22 cents, and I can do it that way and send those to you at the end of the month. And you can collect them, put them in a 3-hole notebook because I refer to back programs, and then it's easier to look them up. The Washington Times had an article that I just briefly mentioned last week, but I wanted to give you the source. It was February 26, 1986, about Willard Al Rockwell, Jr., the chairman of Rockwell International, the former chairman, offering to replace the Challenger and putting it in the hands of private industry. It would involve the privatization pitch, which is taking place, not separate from what the Heritage Foundation wrote a memo about, turning over the space shuttle program to private people, identical to IG Farben, the pharmaceutical company that was making synthetic rubber, and about 2,000 items for Adolf Hitler, to privatize the space. Now, Mr. Rockwell's money comes from the profits of the ships that we've already paid him and gone into debt for, his warfare weaponry. But he has offered to be the front man. He has a company called Astrotech. Now, Astrotech is 14% owned by Rockwell. It lost $5.9 million last year on a revenue of $122 million, and it had a hefty long debt of $80 million. So be careful. He's offering to put in $2 billion on the spaceship with those kind of debts last year. The Wall Street Journal, March the 5th, cites something or a couple of items along that line, even more sinister. It's titled, Buy a New Shuttle. Our 5-man firm will get right on it. And it refers to Mr. Rockwell proposing to raise the $1.5 billion or $2 billion for the shuttle. And then a Daniel R. Sanford from Dallas, Texas, a small firm called Captronics Manufacturing. He won't tell how he raises the money. We're a private company, and that's private. Now, that could be money from IG Farben. It could be from Roman Haas. It could be from any private front organization that did business with Hitler, that is continuing the Fourth Reich, that could do operations on the shuttle that would be accountable to nobody. The Wall Street Journal goes on, even more secretive about plans for the shuttle is a 4th candidate called Romulus, R-U-M-U-L-U-S, Michigan-based Batten Heads Company, Romulus Batten, B-A-T-T-E-N, Heads Incorporated. Among other things, it does defense engineering and design work. Its president, Cyril Batten, won't discuss its finances, its shuttle plans, its facilities, its employees, or anything else. We don't want to let the cat out of the bag. I think of the yacht that Aristotle Onassis had that left Monte Carlo, went back and forth to Argentina with all German crews. Nobody spoke English. If it's his business, I won't tell you where the money comes. We'll put it up. You can be very much scared about the way the space program could go or shift gears, and I think you can start to be frightened right now. The subject of politics will be coming up to the Challenger story over and over again. The San Francisco Chronicle had a quotation today. A former NASA budget analyst said yesterday, if the space agency managers had been more attuned to human risks rather than political pressures, they would have heeded the warning about the rocket booster problems. Now, what were the political pressures? Do they go beyond, of course, the White House and the item it had to launch tonight? What were the political pressures, knowing the ship would blow up? What comes next, and what kind of chances or orders did they take? And the word political, as I say, returns again. Another spokesman for Cape Canaveral, their Center Director Richard Smith, is criticizing the Presidential Commission. He says key NASA officials will leave. The agency will be crippled. They were already leaving, and I'm adding up the numbers of people in the situations that took place before this was exposed, and he is questioning their right of the media to distort certain questions and the integrity of the agency and certain individuals. It's the same Richard Smith that I questioned the very first broadcast I did after the Challenger went down. That was broadcast number 739, where he had a press conference the very next day. He was asked about the icicles and so forth, and he said indications were that there was very little risk involved. And remember how shocked I was that there should be any risk involved, and he's very casual. There was very little, and now he's angry that people are looking into what the risk was that did take place, and the Challenger blew up. I'm not going to do much on the Contras. The president is pushing for $100 million. Robert Dornan says it's $170 million. The San Francisco Examiner, March 16th, has a huge front-page story by Seth Rosenfield about arrests in the San Francisco Bay Area. One in particular that involved $100 million. 430 pounds of cocaine came in on Pier 96 in San Francisco. It involved two men, Mr. Zavala and Cabezas, and Mr. Zavala said that the money went to the Contras, that it was political money, really political money, for the reinstatement of democracy in Nicaragua. Now, democracy in Nicaragua with those drug dealers is like democracy in Cuba with Batista as president, prostitution, narcotics, and the mafia using it as their headquarters. The CIA is involved in this, and the case has been locked up. The papers have been locked up, and there is going to be a trial in Costa Rica for Mr. Pereira, and maybe he'll bring in some of the stories of the CIA and the involvement there if he isn't killed before that takes place. The L.A. Herald, has a picture of a lot of property, L.A. property that Mr. Marcos and his wife Imelda own under the name of her sister and his former mistress. And there's a photograph of a whole group of houses in Beverly Hills. One is at 506 Walden Drive. My parents live right up the block on the 600 block of Walden Drive, so when I'm down there this week, I have to be down Beverly Hills. I'll walk down the street and take a picture of that. They also own 4 homes on Maple Drive. The first home I ever had after we were able and fortunate enough to get a home in Beverly Hills was on Maple Drive, the house right next door to one that the Marcoses own, and they have 4 houses on that street. The picture of their home is 336 South Maple Drive, the one next to the one we had, another at 353, and so forth. They have homes all over Beverly Hills and very close to where I lived. I guess they have good taste like I have. Who knows what? I don't have their money, but I have the same taste. Last week I talked about some very important interconnecting links that I have to do just one broadcast on again. The links to the Heritage Recommendation, the Heritage Foundation, that is behind Ronald Reagan all the way in his administration, and the recommendation to privatize the Space Shuttle program and put their laboratories up there where they could work on such matters that affect the private sector, such as health and agriculture and so forth. Put it up, privatize it, and nobody needs to know what the private corporation is doing. Take the money then and put it into the Star Wars and also to the transmospheric airplane, the vehicle which is part of the Star Wars, and Ronald Reagan, of course, is pushing that. And they not only is the Heritage linked to some very dangerous institutions that could be associated with genocide from the past or possibly in the future, but in comes the Hoover Institute in the past month and a half, pushing right after Ronald Reagan's speech, 4 days later, his speech to the Congress, for their money to study the causes of AIDS coming out of the Hoover Institute, a very political organization in their concern for AIDS and pushing to isolate people and mark them with armbands and predicting 10 to 20 million deaths in a short while. Then add to that the NASA suggestion that from Houston, Texas, that they use the space orbits for genetic engineering, strengthening crops, understanding human disease, and you have a hunk of interest in the exact things that the Heritage Foundation would be concerned with, mass elimination of population and thereby not having too much poverty, and genocide. So NASA and the Hoover Institute and the Heritage Foundation seem to have common interests, and then add the Hughes Medical Institute, another that is a perfect example of the secrecy where nobody can go in and find out what their doctors do, how much they're paid, what their research does, and they disperse money all over the United States to hospitals, and we have no record of the medical schools and hospitals or of what they're doing. because it's private and they're dispensing money in Houston that does link directly to a former astronaut, to the NASA program, to Mr. Robert Rich. I cited him last week, Henry Kuss, K-U-S-S, not Robert Rich, a former deputy assistant with the Defense Department who's dispensing this money, and there is a very dangerous situation here, which I cited in general, a few particular articles, and I'm going to go back to them before long and go chart out the institutions and the money that we know about. Certainly can't touch the ones that they're secretive about. I referred last week to covert action and some quotations in their last issue, number 25, regarding the Nazis in Greece, and that same issue has it's a whole part on the Nazis and their role with the OSS and the Waffen-SS and Allen Dulles and the CIA just before the end of the war and after the war, and the melding of these organizations together. And there's one page in this issue, page 26, Nazi Doctors in Demand, and it tells about Project Paperclip and the medical staff in Frankfurt, Germany, September 1951. After 28 months with Project Paperclip, medical staff in Frankfurt, Germany, Major General Walter Emil Schreiber was brought to the United States for a 6-month stint at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. As Nazi Chief of Medical Science, Dr. Schreiber was directly responsible for ghoulish experiments the Nazis conducted on inmates, and massive evidence revealed at the time of the Nuremberg trials some of the experiments, which included injecting humans with typhus and virus and producing live vaccine, injecting others with infectious epidemic, jaundice, sterilizing by surgery, X-ray, and drugs, submerging victims in tanks of ice water to measure shock levels, locking prisoners in low-pressure chambers to simulate flight altitudes of up to 68,000 feet, which result in the collapse of the lungs, and exposing subjects to heavy doses of incendiary phosphorus materials. Now, when I read the list of things that the Air Force wanted to use of Dr. Schreiber, they could also be applicable to the people in the space shuttle that are being examined very secretively with autopsies, because the bodies were preserved in the cold weather. Then they could take them secretly and check up some of these very identical experiments that were done earlier that are much more sophisticated now. And Dr. Schreiber worked for Project Paperclip, which involved the Nazi rocket scientists, and I'll do more about him also, but I think it's important to know that the use of these Nazis was important for the United States, and they were brought to this country, again, through Project Paperclip, and Mr. Schreiber was taken to Argentina in May 22nd, 1952, and of course Joseph Mengele went down there with his medical records, and so also the United States joined forces, according to covert action, with Major General Kurt Blome, B-L-O-M-E. Some of the Nuremberg charges against him were wholesale practice of euthanasia, injecting intravenous undiluted lethal phenol, execution of tubercular prisoners, use of biological warfare. His specialty was brought to the United States, and they used in July 1945 for interrogations. He conducted experiments on victims with plague vaccines, and he worked with Heinrich Himmler. Blum was acquitted by the Nuremberg Tribunal, even though the prosecutors gathered a great deal of evidence against his activities, and 2 months after his acquittal, he was contacted by 4 employees of the Army Chemical Corps of Fort Detrick for a discussion about biological warfare. And Fort Detrick is the location that I have cited for the plans to make a disease that could be translated to be AIDS that would not respond to various treatments, would break down the immune system. Blum cooperated, he worked, he volunteered the names of other German biological warfare specialists, and in August of 1951, he signed a Project 63 contract as a camp doctor at the U.S. Army Occupation Force European Command Intelligence Center at Oberursel. A frequent Defense Department contractual document showed entry under the head of his qualifications, Professor of Medicine with emphasis on research of tuberculosis and cancer and biological warfare. one of the lesser-known Nazi doctors, Mr. Strughold, Strughold, a Luftwaffe member, was reportedly knowledgeable about low-pressure chamber experiments on camp inmates, and they said it's not known whether he came to the United States as part of the Paperclip Project. In 1963, he did work for the Air Force for many years. He's still living. Today, he's at Brooks Air Force Institute near San Antonio, Texas. It is the Herberta Strughold Aeromedical Library, named after him, the father of aerospace medicine. So if you think that my ideas about the outrageous implications of the Heritage Institute, of Hughes Medical Institute, of the privatization of Rockwell, of these other firms that won't tell you where they're getting their money, you can worry a great deal about what is going on with the space situation and also with diseases on planet Earth, and how much are they going to be used to wipe out the population. I'm sure if you are reading the newspapers, you're seeing all of the warnings of impending catastrophe that would happen on the shuttle program. The New York Times had a story, 1983 report on shuttle, warning of catastrophe, and I've cited that before, and they mentioned the danger that it would have because the next probe would contain plutonium and a high dangerous element if it explodes and particles are inhaled. This was also reprinted in the Los Angeles Herald, February the 1st, 1986, and it tells about interviews with NASA officials and the dangers of flying with these conditions that they knew about, and a 92-page report dated December 1983 by R.K. Weatherwax, president of Sierra Energy and Risk Assessment, a subcontractor to the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in New Mexico. The report was ordered distributed only to government agencies, not to the public, but the report was made available to the New York Times by the House Subcommittee on Energy Conservation and Power. The chairman of the subcommittee, Edward J. Markey, a Massachusetts Democrat, said he was particularly interested in the report because it addressed potential accidents involving radiation from 2 shuttle missions that were planned for later this year because of the particles exploding if it was inhaled. Markey said his interest also was stimulated by a February 5th article in the New York Times that NASA didn't use the most rigorous analysis available to mitigate potential accidents, and because of the internal study, if accurate, it indicated that a number of planned shuttle launches could assure the catastrophe a virtual certainty, but the important thing besides the certainty is the fact that the next launch would have the plutonium on it. And I briefly mentioned that last week. Now, when I wrote for the realist Paul Krasner in 1974, the SLA is the CIA, I felt that after that incident that was manipulated, and that was the COINTEL program, the Operation Chaos of Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese, that the final way to scare this country would be to have fictitious liberation armies organized to plan acts of violence that would include chemical warfare, and that would bring the Federal Emergency Management Agency into operation. And I could see this being used on us as an excuse to take control. On March the 1st, 1986, and I just cited this briefly last week, Challenger death may avert nuclear disaster, Jesse Jackson says. And in this particular article from the Houston Post, he tells about the launches that are now being postponed, the 2 that were to take place, and that the 2 involved radioactive plutonium, which is the most toxic substance known to scientists, and concerns launching shuttles carrying it aboard their cargo. And this should have been raised before this January 28th shuttle explosion, but it came out now. It was secretive until then. And Jesse Moore, the new head of the Space Agency, the one who gave the green light on launching on January 28th, said it's too early to judge if launching the plutonium-powered probes is too risky. It's too early to judge. That's a topic that's going to get a lot of attention, he said. And the question was, how much risk is there involved in this particular space shuttle program when they are so careless the way one exploded and obviously probably knew it was going to happen, but what about the next 2 if this one had actually survived the cold weather? Jesse Jackson said maybe the 7 who died would save 4 billion. I suppose he means the world population, and there are terrible dangers involved in taking plutonium up there, seeing the casual way in which these people handle this material, or was it casual? The real deep question is, was the Federal Emergency Management Agency just there waiting for an accident to happen, and could it happen in this particular area? February the 6th, 1986, Los Angeles Times has a story, nuclear cargo seen risky for shuttle flights. The fiery explosion that ripped the Challenger raises questions about the vulnerability of nuclear cargoes intended in the future flights. The next mission, after the ill-fated Challenger, would carry the nuclear-powered Ulysses solar probe satellite into orbit. The scientists say radioactive plutonium particles scattered at smoke or dust debris would pose a serious public health hazard to anyone who inhaled the cancer-causing residue. A cloud of plutonium particles released in the sky over Canaveral could turn parts of Florida into an area that's uninhabitable, said Dr. John Goffman, a professor of medical physics at UC Berkeley. The Energy Department contends that the protective shell around plutonium would withstand the explosive pressures, but however, a NASA safety analysis said that a wide range of possible shuttle accidents could generate greater force. And we're wondering, what is that green box that they're looking for? And already they've spent about $25 million on the search. And I'm wondering what there is down there that they've already spent approximately $25 million or more. And there was warning about a green box. And I wonder if there was plutonium on this particular Challenger. The article goes on to say Diane Butler, an Energy Department spokesman, said Wednesday it appears the Challenger's explosion would not have been sufficient to create a deadly plutonium cloud. The nuclear generators are wrapped in iridium, I'll get it right, and then encapsulated in graphite shell that would protect it. NASA administrators declined comment on the force of the blast, but their safety analysis check showed that by activating the spacecraft's command destruct mechanisms, explosive devices attached to the large external tank and suspected of being detonated would produce a burst of pressure ranging from 740 psi to 7,800. Now the article goes on, in a draft environmental impact for Project Galileo, NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory talked about the risk of plutonium dispersal. It would be small due to the high reliability inherent in the design, and this is what they told, the high reliability of the booster going off before, and they felt that the chances of injury from plutonium were not too great during this period. But Mr. Goffman at UC Berkeley was not reassured. What happened last week didn't happen the way they said it would. I don't honestly know if plutonium could be dispersed by such an explosion, but for something as hazardous as plutonium, I'd want more assurance of safety. And they referred to the Galileo and Ulysses, which would go up next, which wouldn't be the first nuclear-equipped satellites launched by the United States. NASA has 22 payloads, including some aboard the manned Apollo lunar probes and various satellites that incorporate plutonium fuel generators. These launches resulted in aborts in 1964. They had navigational problems, and they burned up on re-entry, and according to Goffman, traces of plutonium were scattered around the globe, leaving trivial amounts in virtually all living things. In 1968, a meteorological satellite was destroyed, and part of it was recovered and found from the ocean intact, according to NASA. And in 1970, the Apollo 13 mission curtailed an explosion in flight, jettisoned its plutonium generator prior to re-entry. It's deposited in the South Pacific's Tonga Trench, where, according to NASA, it is effectively isolated from man's environment. So that they have had problems, and plutonium is around in the environment, and there's been a warning that the 50 pounds of plutonium that they were going to put on the next spaceship is astronomical. It poses an environmental threat only if it's inhaled, according to NASA scientists. If it comes back to Earth the size of marbles, there's no problem, but you can kiss off any area that gets dusted. That's pretty casual, to kiss off any area. Dr. Kendall, chairman of Union of Concerned Scientists in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is concerned. He shares Mr. Goffman's concern about plutonium danger, He says if it just fell in a big chunk, it could be retrieved. It might upset people, but it would not in any sense produce a holocaust. But there are risks if it should break, and it would require presidential approval if it had to be obtained and before the nuclear cargo could be launched aboard the shuttle Atlantis, and the pieces of it, as I say, would be scattered around the globe. If it fell in hunks, you could pick it up. If it's scattered, it would be very dangerous. And maybe, as I say, that's why they're looking for that little box in Florida to see if there was anything on there or not. We don't know, but they're very secretive, and some of the scientists are warning that it could be dangerous. Now, to get back to plutonium and the rocket scientists and an area which is seems a little bit fringe or offy, but I want to mention it because I think it's pertinent to the dangers of people handling this material and what they do with this material and who are those who have it. How safe is it? And just loading it, whether it falls in dust or chunks, is a matter of argument, I guess, between the scientists, the differences in danger. But there are a lot of people who are getting their hands on the plutonium besides those very people who promise to be so exact. Remember the Goetz story that was in the news for a long time and has been out of the news for a long time? Mr. Goetz, the son of immigrants from Germany who lived in New York City, Bernard Goetz, who shot 4 people on the subway and left one of them paralyzed. Time magazine, January the 14th, has an article about Bernard Goetz, end of the line. And the reason I'm bringing Bernard Goetz up is that there were threats to put plutonium, the very material that is so dangerous, it's going up in the next 2 shuttle programs, or was scheduled to go. There were threats to put plutonium in the water of New York and poison the people in New York if Mr. Bernard Goetz wasn't let off and wasn't prosecuted. And going back to Time magazine, January the 14th, called End of the Line, the subway shooter surrenders, visitors to Warner, New Hampshire often stop by Hillside Books, an antique bookstore, to sit by the fire and chat with owner Thomas Stotler. A day or 2 after Christmas, a mild-mannered traveler dropped in. He said he was from New York, wanted to get away from the city. He told Stotler he had been mugged 5 times, stalked at length, had little protection from New York criminals. The book dealer asked his guest if he had heard about the fugitive vigilante who had shot 4 youths in New York City, and he said yes. How did you hear about it? The visitor asked. He was interested in it, said Stotler. He didn't try to pin me down for details, and after a while he left without purchasing a book. I thought he was a nice guy, and after hearing what he did, I still do. And after a few days after visiting the bookstore, Bernard Goetz, 37, ended his 9 days flight from justice, and he had driven a car to New Hampshire in a rented car, went to the bookstore, and then went back and turned himself in. And as I say, he is the son of immigrants from Germany living in New York City, and he has a company, he calls it, it's supposed to be his own company, Electronics Calibrations Laboratory in Greenwich Village, which he has been running this company for quite a while and lived in a particular apartment there since 1976. Now, the Daily World had an article August 2nd, 1985, calls a bomb humanitarian, and the article is about the same Tom Stotler who Bernard Goetz went all the way up to New Hampshire to visit. And incidentally, the reason I'm bringing this up is it's the same town in New Hampshire where Krista McAuliffe came from, and a man who was doing press coverage for her for months was referring to Bernard Goetz being up in New Hampshire. And I'm thinking of plutonium and NASA and the operations whereby certain people can have access to plutonium and threaten a city like New York or threaten the whole United States, similar to what I put in the Realist in 1974. That's why I'm bringing this up now. Call a bomb humanitarian. The article goes on. An ultra-right group called Freedom Through Strength plans to use a full-page ad in the Washington newspaper to advertise and emphasize what it calls the humanitarian aspect of bombing Hiroshima. The paid message in the Washington Times. Now, that's the paper run by Reverend Moon, and the editor is Arnaud de Bourgegrave, and this is the nest of the counterintelligence, covert action, spy teams of the far, far right. The paid message in Washington Times, the ultra-right publication owned by the Unification Church, is to coincide with peace demonstrations around the world calling for an end to the nuclear arms race. Freedom Through Strength advocates a massive military buildup at the expense of people's social needs. It has been recruiting mercenaries to fight in Central America. Tom Stotler is a member of Freedom Thought Through Strength. He owns the New Hampshire bookstore where New York City subway gunman Bernard Goetz went last December after he shot 4 black teenagers. Goetz met with Stotler. Freedom Through Strength developed out of the Liberty Lobby, an anti-labor, racist, and anti-Semitic organization similar to the Klan, which operated in the 50s and 60s. The Reverend Jerry Falwell and people close to the Reagan administration are connected to the Liberty Lobby. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back to Bernard Goetz and Mr. Stotler, the Washington Times, Liberty Lobby, and the space program, Plutonium. And is there any connection? There are between a lot of these people, but how far-reaching will the plutonium go into our cities? This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of broadcast number 745, March the 17th, 1986. I hope you tape this, and we take this 1-minute break so you can turn your tape over and start taping the other side and keep a record of it. So I'll number the second half. I usually do. The Washington Post had a story February the 10th, 1985, that I had on the air a while back, but I want to repeat it now because of recent developments. Bernard Goetz had a super-secret astro security clearance from the federal government. Channel 4 News reported, WNBC in New York City. The clearance granted to the subway vigilante 2 years ago gives him access to classified weapons information. Sources say Goetz worked as a contract employee for government intelligence agencies. He performed sophisticated electronic calibrations involved in nuclear weapon, which could also target or cause something to explode, a remote control, I imagine. Goetz is regarded as an expert in highly specialized field. It was not immediately known exactly what projects he worked on. The CIA and Defense Department declined to comment. To obtain an astro clearance, Goetz had to be thoroughly investigated by intelligence agencies. Goetz's clearance gives him access to secret technical data relating to some of the deadliest weapons known to civilization, and I'm sure that would include plutonium in that little green box that is missing from the Challenger explosion. The National Enquirer had a story about Goetz. This goes back a couple of years also, but it's very important to remember the National Enquirer, if you don't like their source, was the newspaper that interviewed Kathy Smith, who said she killed John Belushi, and just last week they decided, yes, she has to stand trial. The LAPD kicked her out of town and told her to get to Canada. They didn't want to bother with the case. It was too hot, of course, but she gave it to the National Enquirer. Why always remains interesting, but she did. And they also carried a story with an interview of Bernard Goetz, subway vigilante, his own incredible story. Don't call me a hero. I'm just a proud American, he said. Americans have to do what too many of us have forgotten how to do. Stand up and say no to the sewer rats of society who are pushing us around. I thought the word sewer rat was interesting because that was the classification for Zyklon B that was made by Otto Ambros of IG Farben. Ambros came to this country through Project Paperclip, and the rat extermination chemical was the one put into the ceilings at Auschwitz for mass extermination. It made it very convenient, and they didn't have to pull so many bullets and so much mess of shooting people. And the Zyklon B was for rat extermination, and he has access to the deadliest of weapons, and he refers to the sewer rats of society. The Washington Times, run by Reverend Moon, had an article September the 4th, 1985, about Bernard Goetz, how liberals react to crime, and it refers to Bernard Goetz and the shooting in New York City, and how he went up to New Hampshire and turned himself in and had mass media appeal, and how Mr. Morgenthau, the district attorney in New York City, didn't indict him, let him off. He was running for elections. But I wonder if Bernard Goetz was too important. And then the article goes on about some other muggings and shootings that took place in New York City, and how come people are not more strict about the crime that's going on in New York City. The attention Mr. Goetz got, and he got off, is one thing, but what are the liberals going to do while people are mugged? And it's about the liberal mentality allowing these things to happen, and the liberals let Mr. Goetz off, but he certainly isn't a liberal. Several months ago, I referred to a man who got the death sentence for giving murder by cancer. But it might be pertinent again to this story of poisons also. From Omaha, Nebraska, November 8, 1979, Stephen Roy Harper was the first person given the death sentence because of giving murder by cancer. It was a first-degree murder on 2 persons with a cancer-causing rocket fuel additive. And I thought, considering the rocket problems and the space program and the dangers incurred here, that Bernard Goetz could also have access to these. And the article goes on, 2 people died within a week after consuming lemonade and milk from a 2-quart container in their home that was contaminated with dimethyl nitrosamine, an anti-corrosive rocket fuel additive known to cause cancer in the laboratory rats. And, of course, Goetz referred to those rats. And Harper stole the lethal substance from the Hoover Institute for Cancer Research, where he worked as a lab assistant. So Mr. Goetz was involved with Star Wars, also with the nuclear program. Another article referred to his Star Wars context and his clearance there. And then he goes to Concord, New Hampshire, and he visits a man who is very political, and Time magazine cites his visit there at the bookstore with a man who turns out to be a very far right person with links to Liberty Lobby and the Washington Times, Mr. Thomas Stadler, and Goetz, having come from Germany, former German immigrants getting to this country, and he is part of the guidance system and nuclear missiles and systems that could affect nuclear missiles. And Mr. Stadler, his friend, has an organization as part of Freedom Through Strength that defends the atomic bombs and mass murders of Hiroshima. And the story about the plutonium and the next 2 shuttles is referred to as a possible Hiroshima activity. And that could bring us into a total police state. And Freedom Through Strength has links, as I say, to Liberty Lobby and Jerry Falwell and the very far right, who are pushing the Star Wars and the problems that would affect all of us, that should not be in the hands of those crazies. Now, the New York Times had an article on the 27th of July, 1985. New York is seeking the source of plutonium because there were threats about the plutonium being put in the water. The testing process is prolonged because the equipment used by the Environmental Measurement Laboratory of the Energy Department can test only 2 samples at one time. It takes 3 to 6 weeks. New York City is trying to narrow down the levels of plutonium that are in their water, and they're getting anonymous letters. They got one April the 1st that they kept secret until July, when plutonium was noticed in the New York City waters, that there was a threat to contaminate the water system unless all charges were dropped against Bernard Goetz, who had been indicted in March on charges of shooting 4 on the Manhattan subway. Another article, August the 14th, 1985, traces of plutonium in New York City in the water called normal so far. And I repeat, he had top security clearance with nuclear missiles. And after shooting those 4 blacks in New York City, he became a subject of hero to the Aryan Nations up in Idaho. Now, Richard Butler of Aryan Nations worked for Lockheed on the U-2 program, and Lockheed was in charge of the security of the Challenger that went down, or the 2 next ones that would go up with the plutonium on them. His name became associated with the Aryan Nations, and after May 1st, when there were threats that they were going to put plutonium into the water in New York City and turn this country into Vietnam, these letters were mailed to Mayor Koch in April, and then they were revealed, as I say, because of levels of plutonium which they tested. So it's interesting that the links of Mr. Stadler to Freedom Through Strength, that organization, that right-wing group, and why would Bernard Goetz just happen to go up to Warner, New Hampshire, and stumble into that bookstore to see this particular gentleman who has the bookstore? It's just not an ordinary place that you go into. Now, the March 1st newspapers, San Francisco Chronicle this week, have an article, prosecutors pressing the Goetz case. We'll see what happens if there's plutonium in New York, or what is going on and how much it will affect that trial or the people living in New York City. February the 9th, 1986, Morgenthau, in appeal, asserts the judge erred in the Goetz ruling, and they're going to go on with the trial of Mr. Goetz, and there's a quotation in the New York Times. You seem to be all right. Here's another, Mr. Goetz said. He told the youth after he shot him. He looked at him and thought he looked too well. I'll give you another one. If I had more bullets, I would have shot him again and again. Mr. Morgenthau called the cabbie shooting legally inexcusable and a deliberate act of revenge or retribution, not an act supported by belief. But if the act is supported by belief, if he has any links to Mr. Stotler, it is not a retribution of any kind, but it is a belief that the sewer rats and the people on the streets have to be eliminated, as well as the Hiroshima can eliminate large masses of population. Now, just as a coincidental article on January 28th in the Washington Post, there was a story about a man, a journalist named Bob Holler, 34 years old, a reporter and columnist for Concord Monitor in Concord, New Hampshire, the hometown of Krista McAuliffe. He said he's come to think of McAuliffe as a second wife. For 7 months, he's followed her, the social studies teacher. He's followed her journey from obscurity to national celebrity. Sunday night, he slept little. This was the big day. It was potentially important. He said, we had some potentially important primaries in Concord that week. We also had a visit from Bernie Goetz, New York subway vigilante, not long ago. But basically for Concord, this is a story of a decade, not a century. So I'm wondering, in 1986, he says Bernard Goetz was up there not long ago, whether it's a figure of speech, just going back to the shooting a year and a half ago, or whether he means he was just there in the last few weeks to visit Mr. Stotler. That would be really interesting to know. And again, not coincidentally, but the Washington Times is a great big sounding board for things that have happened or will happen. The Houston Post and the Washington Times are great for that. And February 17th, 1986 is a full-page article, I mean a huge one, with a picture of the new head of the Federal Emergency Management Service, General Julius Beckton, B-E-C-T-O-N, the director of FEMA. He's not talking about the past problems. He's going on now to take care and charge of the Federal Emergency Management. And that, if the plutonium were to come out, if one of the shuttles were to go down, and they knew it was a near explosion, it was a matter of time, and if they had the plutonium on it, then what would be the next step of the federal government? So there's a description of Lieutenant General Julius W. Beckton, Jr. from the United States Army, who's now in charge of our civil defense, and enlisted during World War II in the Pacific Theater. He fought in the Korean War. He was a company commander, twice wounded by the Red Chinese, I guess like John Birch, and must have a vengeance for that kind of a bullet and shrapnel. He went from Vietnam to Fort Hood, Texas, to Stuttgart, Germany, and goodness knows how long he was in Germany. I wonder whether he worked with the Kriegsakademie in Germany. If it's currently running, I'm sure it is, like our West Point at this time. He has a son at George Washington University studying international affairs, who just graduated from Valley Forge Military Academy as a first captain, and a daughter who's a lieutenant engineer in the Air Force. And he tells about working and studying disaster from food relief in Ethiopia to the Mexican earthquake and so forth. And he refuses to talk about Louis Gufarida, who was removed because of controversy with FEMA, but he is there in case there are problems of emergency and attacks. He said, we're prepared for all aspects of a nuclear attack except for radiation. It's interesting that he put that in just the same week that they're talking about radiation and the probability that if the Challenger's successing flights, if that hadn't gone down, the successors were filled with radiation, and the same statistics of the chances of going down were there and would have hit that one, we would have had the radiation. This is February the 17th, 1986. We're ready for everything but radiation. I believe that they're ready for radiation also. Now, the remaining time of this time, I want to just briefly run into some elements I wanted to do a whole hour, 2 hours on. Of course, time does slip away. It has to do with advanced genetic sciences in California and update you on the testing. I want to do a biography of the new appointment of the head of the Agricultural Department, a very controversial person, Mr. Ling, L-Y-N-G, who worked for Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. He worked for a lot of controversial people. Richard Ling. The Washington Post has a story February 15th. I'll do more on his background later. Also, the second person in the Agricultural Department, Deputy Agricultural Secretary, John Norton III, was kicked out rapidly this past month, February the 20th, to replace him with somebody from Kansas City. They didn't want him in. They wanted someone from Kansas City, and there are offices of Roman Haas and Advanced Genetic Sciences in Kansas City. If you have not listened to the past broadcast on Advanced Genetic Sciences, it's a corporation headquartered in Oakland, which is funded from Europe and from the Eastern corporations, that wants to put into Monterey County the first altered live genetic bacteria into the produce in this county and release it in Monterey County. And what happened in the past weeks is that they admitted that they already have used some of it. March the 15th, 1986, the Monterey Herald had a story, bacteria testing alleged that they already went ahead and put this genetically altered strain of bacteria into a Castroville area, and I'll do details of this again. I'll get back to it later. The company Advanced Genetic Sciences apologized March the 5th, LA Times. We should have reported the bacteria test. We went ahead and did it even though you weren't giving us the go-ahead to do it. Washington Post had a story March 5th. Gene engineer concedes real lack of wisdom. The microbe was tested months before the U.S. approval. I'm rushing through those real fast just to put for the remainder of the program an article that you can copy from the New York Times or send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send it to you. Dated March the 6th. Genetic concern on the spot. This is the way it begins. Befitting an impoverished state, Advanced Genetic Sciences occupies one floor of a threadbare building in a non-glamorous part of Oakland. There are bullet holes in the windows of the lobby. Now, if I have time, I'll list the board of directors again and where they come from. This is a dummy front that's known as a doorknob operation. What they call an impoverished state is a multi-billion-dollar project that uses a dummy front in case anything goes wrong. The article goes on this roof, the company's scientists performed experiments that catapulted in a slew of problems with the government. Some fear will result in more delays for all genetic engineering companies. Last November, AGS got permission to conduct their first release in the environment of an organism altered by genetic engineering. The company planned to spray a strawberry patch in Monterey County, California, with bacteria that inhabits the plants, but it's genetically altered by them. Last week, it came to light that the company violated federal guidelines by conducting tests with the bacteria in open air in Oakland, and they also have done it, it seems, in Castroville, closer to my home area. To test whether the bacteria would harm the plants, they injected fruit trees with modified bacteria, posing a risk that they could escape into the environment. The disclosure prompted the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to open the investigation. On Tuesday, the company was called to Congress, where Representative Harold L. Volkmer, V-O-L-K-M-E-R, Volkmer, chairman of the House Sciences and Technology Committee investigating the subcommittee, raised questions about the validity of the company's scientific tests. The Missouri Democrat said in an interview today that the company seemed to be in a big hurry to get its tests done. Now, to be in a big hurry was the story about why the shuttle was launched. They seemed to be in a hurry. That is a good cover story, and they have a dummy front office in Oakland. Besides sullying the company's reputation, the incident has given new fuel to critics of such testing who are concerned that such work could have unintended environmental effects. It has raised fears among other biotechnology companies. A backlash will result in more delays and regulations for everyone. It sure isn't going to help us, said Ronald E. Capay, chairman of the Cetus Corporation. Cetus is part owner of AgroCetus, one of the companies wanting to do outdoor testing of genetically engineered plants. At the House hearing and interviews this week, AGS said the company's scientific work was valid. They were convinced the bacteria is harmless, and injecting them inside a tree would pose little risk. Nevertheless, the company, after first saying it had not violated guidelines, said it realizes it should have gotten Environmental Protection Agency approval on the roof test. It appears the company seriously underestimated the possible public reaction to its work and the seriousness of strict adherence to guidelines. Like many a young company, and this is the other lie, a third lie. One is that it's in a hurry, one that it's a small, poor group, and the other is that it's a young company. These are the most sophisticated people from Harvard, Princeton, Roman Haas, IG Farben, and the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and scientists from Europe. They refer to it as a young company where they hung up their shingles 1969 to get ready for this project. They've worked on it a long time. Like a young company in high technology, it seems to have progressed in its scientific accomplishments without commensurate growth in other facets necessary for a well-rounded business. Well, that's like just manufacturing Zyklon B and nothing else. If you have one gas that can control the entire world, you don't have to have 2 or 3 other businesses. It says the country estimated the difficulty involved because of their lack of experience, said Thomas Diotte, former president of AGS, who now has gone back to Roman Haas, which is the multi-billion-dollar parent corporation. They didn't do the PR necessary to be able to perform the experiment, said Noel Masterson, president of Science Future. The PR is what Reagan uses to sell the Contras. The PR is what you use to sell the Marcos in the Philippines. The PR sells Iran. The PR sells you Somoza. The PR means that you hard sell people over and over in the media, and then you get through what you want. The trouble was not that it wouldn't be safe, but the PR is what they need. So they've hired a new PR agency to help them with the project. Advanced Sciences, Genetic Sciences, was founded in 1969 by Daniel D. Adams, a venture capitalist from Greenwich, Connecticut. That's the man from the offices of Sullivan Cromwell, the law firm of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, and I've cited the record of genocide and the use of those agencies to protect the people that did genocide in Europe and then were brought to this country under Project Paperclip. He was instrumental in founding Biogen, another biotechnology concern. Mr. Adams ran Advanced Genetic Sciences from Connecticut, and even through the company's operation, even though they were in Oakland, Kansas, and in Europe. In June, Mr. Adams stepped down as chief executive, and now Chairman Joseph Boucaert has come in, Bouckaert, a Belgian who's head of the Plant Genetic Systems, a Belgian company of which AGS owns 1/3. To run both companies, he commutes between Belgium and Oakland. This is this little rundown shabby office in Oakland, okay? And there's no frost in Belgium, only in Monterey County. And Mr. Diotte has left AGS and gone back to Roman Haas, where he went from Princeton to Roman Haas, still working with the company. And it goes into their losses of millions of dollars, but they're banking on this particular operation. The company has been dependent on investments in and on research contracts, but according to analysts who no longer follow the company, it is undercapitalized. In total, Advanced Genetic has raised $24 million from Roman Haas, that's that multi-billion corporation with Defense Department contracts, and Hillshog AB, a Swedish company which owns 16%, and also the Belgian company. Incidentally, Roman Haas has one of their branches is in Huntsville, Alabama, the very location where the NASA scientists ordered those in Utah to rethink their decisions and go ahead and force this launch. Mr. Boucaert, who was trained in business and in law, spent a career organizing technological research in Belgium universities and the Belgian government. He will settle permanently in California, which means we won't be able to stop this. You know that. He said that earlier this week the company has set up a committee to monitor adherence to guidelines and hiring a public relations firm, Book and Company, B-O-O-K-E and Company. Last year, AGS got a desperate need cash infusion of $4 million from another Swedish company, Karashams. I can't pronounce the last word. It is trying to win research contracts from larger companies. Already has agreements with Roman Haas, DuPont, Standard Oil, formerly known as Standard Oil of Ohio. So you have the Chase Manhattan, the IG Farben, the Allen Dulles, the John Foster Dulles, the Sullivan Cromwell, the genocide team out of America and Nazi Germany that set up the CIA, the Project Paperclip, the same people that were not bashful about exterminating before and have those same goals in mind, and these corporations have been linked to genocide, and now they want the cash infusion, which I knew all along would come together. If you read American Swastika or Trading with the Enemy, Charles Hyam has documented the role of DuPont, and Roman Haas has been in many books, the relationship to I.G. Farben and Standard Oil, working with Nazi Germany before the war, after the war, but now they want to bring that money and that agency into Monterey County. Nowhere else on planet Earth but Monterey County. And Mr. Bugart goes between here and Belgium. By 1988, we should be in a break-even situation. By 1988, this is 1986. In 2 more years, they will have money from Roman Haas, DuPont, and Standard Oil, and the head attorney who set this up was from Sullivan and Cromwell. The chief executive is from Belgium. Money comes from Switzerland, and there are a large group of Nazis in Switzerland. In Sweden, pardon me. Well, there are plenty in Switzerland, too. I'm talking about Sweden. If you read Operation Sunrise and another Mr. Kramer, I don't know if he's related to Fritz Kramer or not, but there is a large nucleus of Nazis in Sweden that has never been smoked out, even though they've had Olof Palme as the Prime Minister of Sweden all these years. So in comes this money. We will have this infusion. We will have a public relations firm. By 1988, we will break even, which means they will have made up the 20 to 25 million they put in it so far. The company's first product is called Snowmax, the flip side of Frostban. Instead of altering bacteria to retard frost formation, advanced genetic is killing the bacteria and selling the dead microbes as a yellowish powder to promote frost formation. Snowmax is bought by ski resorts to speed snowmaking. The product also could be used to help freeze foods more quickly and to build islands for oil drilling in the Arctic, the company says. The North Arctic company, where Mr. Lehman says that we will proceed with World War III out of that Arctic, you will put your islands over there, build islands for oil drilling out of the ice, or down at Antarctica for bases. This has to be a much, much larger operation, which I said the day I heard about the operation. The article goes on, because the bacteria are not genetically altered, there's no problem with putting it into the snow areas now, but the company hopes that Frostban will be their next product after their the Snowmax. And the Environmental Protection Agency investigation, due to end March 24th, that's just a week from today, leads to a decision that allows the company to go ahead with its tests. After that, the company is looking at genetically altering soil-dwelling bacteria to help plants fend off the pests. Now, the pests are a very important part of our environment, so you have 1 week from the time you hear this, or maybe a few days, to call or write the Environmental Protection Agency and ask them if I.G. Farben in Nazi Germany and these companies that worked with Adolf Hitler are moving into Monterey County and can only be here because of the Mexican farm workers and the lack of necessity for them in the area, or if they work, similar to Punamund or Dora, after they work 4 or 5 years from now, being exposed to this kind of bacteria, they die, and then you bring in new strong ones to do the work, and working in the field can pick up diseases if their immune system is weak, and weed out the weak and keep the strongest, just as we did when we imported slaves from Africa. Now, I've cited before on the air, I believe I have, the directory, the corporate directory out of AGS, and I put in detail some of the members of the board, Mr. Bogorod, the chairman of the Compensation Committee, Robert Naylor, and their links to Harvard, to the Roman Haas, to DuPont, and the very questionable organizations that have cited this area, earmarked it, and have the funds and the PR now to get what they want. They started to sneak it in, and they actually did spray here in Castroville, and they're apologizing, and they sprayed in Oakland, and they're apologizing for that. Now, one of the workers that works for AGS was quoted in the San Jose Mercury this past week. A technician for the biotechnology that illegally tested a genetically altered microbe told a House committee he worked and worried about the safety of the experiments. This is similar to the shuttle program. He's worried about the safety. At a hearing Tuesday in Washington of the House Science Technology Subcommittee on Oversight, an unidentified technician charged that his former employee, Advanced Genetic Sciences, pressured him to take shortcuts during the firm's illegal open-air testing in February of 1985. Imagine they were told to stop down here. They were doing it in Berkeley in February 85. The company failed to notify the EPA of the outdoor test. John Bedrock, AGS scientist, vice president, research director, said no canker was detected on trees injected with a microbe designed to halt frost development. But the former technician said in a document released by the panel that canker was found. Canker, he said the company fired him for saying that. The experiment under scrutiny proceeded by 10 months. The EPA's approval of AGS proposal to spray in the Monterey County. Disclosure of the Oakland test increased criticism by Monterey County supervisors and residents, and they also cited in Castroville, an area where they probably have sprayed already. The Monterey County test had been delayed by the supervisors who blocked it temporarily. The EPA official Stephen Sucho testified Tuesday that a diseased area on the injected tree would certainly raise concerns about those cankers. They testified the tests on the roof had no hazard to anybody, no results that were hazardous, and no canker, but this employee said that he began to feel uneasy about not following standard procedures for the test, that he was under continuous pressure to use low levels of inoculated material, and he got so much flack he left them, and he said there was danger involved. Well, I've given you a lot of information for this hour. Now it's up to you to think about and assimilate it because our time is up, and I'll continue along these lines of NASA and AGS and the new appointee of Reagan for the environment when I come back with you next week.